I'm not a technologist. I just pretend to not play one on TV. Sparta wants to join.
Hello, cousin.
Hi.
Hello, cousin.
Hi, cousin.
Hi, cousin.
Hi, cousin.
Hello, cousin. The people on the bus are fascinating people. My favorite ride on the Greyhound would be with Lefty,
Oh,
who wasn't
That's a good one.
actually left-handed.
Who is Lefty? Now, I don't know this story.
Yeah, so I was heading to Thunder Bay on the Greyhound, and I happened to have my newborn baby with me. He was 3 months old, and so I had him tucked in beside me up against the window in his car seat, and I was in the aisle seat. And when we got to Kenora, a bunch of people came on, and there was this guy that sat beside me. You know how the seats are kind of staggered. So he was beside me, but slightly behind me across the aisle. I was curious, as per usual, and started talking to him. I noticed that he was doing origami, which I thought was pretty cool. I'm always fascinated by that. I remember in elementary school, my one friend, she would send these cool notes, all folded up really neatly. And I know some of you have done that as well. But anyway, so I looked over at Lefty and noticed that he was making something. So I struck up a conversation. It was interesting because he just pulled this piece of paper out of his pocket and started folding and doing whatever, making swans and frogs and a bunch of different stuff. And he had told me that he had recently learned how to do that and was using the paper he was using was also from the place where he learned to do this art, which would have been the jail. And so he was using his prison release form to do some origami.
To make an origami. I think I do remember.
This is such a good story. I love that.
Yeah, so the curiosity got the best of me, and eventually I was able to weave our conversation as to how he ended up there. It turns out that he was in there for assault, but he felt that it was an unfair conviction, and he couldn't wait to get home to go beat the out of the guy and had put him in there. And and knowing his name, we exchanged names. His name's Lefty, and I'm always excited because as a left-handed person, I get excited when I meet other left-handed people. And so I asked him if he was, and he said no. So then I was kind of confused about that, but I dropped it. It's like a conversation that he didn't want to pursue. And once we arrived at his destination, which wasn't that far away, a couple of hours maybe, I had hoped by then that I had convinced him that it wouldn't be a good idea to go out of someone. It wouldn't really support his I was wrongfully convicted. And we went on our merry way. The people on the bus are fascinating people. And then I think you are a person on a bus. You are a fascinating person. Why are you there? And my mom, she loves taking the bus. She called the other day to say that there's been a bus route restored between Thunder Bay and Winnipeg. So she's all jazzed about that, so she could take the bus. And I think
that's great news.
Right? But I think it's maybe part of, speaking of DNA, would be people watching. Sure. Those are the people we hail from, are the people watchers.
I think it was a conversation I had with Kerry yesterday. Or maybe it was you, Laura, where I shared that my mother said that my grandmother used to take her and her siblings into town to sit on a park bench or a street bench to just watch people.
That was the outing.
And that was like an outing. And I actually clarified that with my mom, and my mom said, "Oh yeah." And I said, "Did she just like to watch the people, or did she like to talk to people?" And my mom said, "Oh, she loved to talk to people." That's another inherited kind of.
We can't go anywhere with my mom without her talking to everybody. Someone. And if she doesn't, I remember
and if she doesn't, she does now.
She does now. That's right. Where I like spent 20 minutes in the Safeway or someplace with talking to this lady, and I'm, being polite and nodding and being like, "Okay, let's move along here, folks." And after they parted, I was like, "Who's that?" She's like, "I have no idea. I just met them."
That's exactly
new cousin.
New cousin. They have restored those service between Thunder Bay and Sault Ste. Marie as well.
Oh, Oh, awesome.
which is amazing.
Get your news here first from your cousin.
The Cousin News Network.
If you haven't heard.
Yeah. Yeah, some good news. Some good bus news. That's what it is.
Yes, and it's not going to cost $400 trillion. Like, it is still a little bit pricier than what Greyhound was, but perhaps if they get the people, then it won't
Prices could be lowered.
Yeah, and it will stop in White River.
Oh, that's good news. So we can go
Yes.
visit our cousins.
Yes.
So I think one thing as cousins, what we do well in this group of collective cousins is to try to build connection with people. And we do that inherently, I believe, from our parents, from our mothers specifically, who would build connection with others. And, you could see that through, Deets with your grandmother taking, her children to go people watch, or the fact that some folks would say, oh, Kerry, you're such an extrovert. You're so forward and you're talking and energy and movement. And I think, you know what? The truth is, I love watching people. And part of that watching is also how I like to build connection with people. Because I think if we look at people, we watch their body language, their movement, we watch how they interact with others, it's kind of like ammo on how we can interact with that person. And so that could also be why we are notorious for attracting people to us. So I'm talking specifically about strangers, right? They're people that we'd have never met. I can't, as much as I talk about my mother, how she does that, she meets people and next thing you know, we've lost 20 minutes of our lives to them. I do the exact same thing.
Or gained.
But have you lost or have you gained
absolutely. It's
else?
A gain. But I'm just saying, like, I used to see it as a loss, but now that I'm the person who does that, it's so fun. And I usually learn something. I actually have a story I would love to share. So,
safe space.
The summer that we were getting married, it's almost like a rite of passage in joining the family to meet the cousins. And so that's what we were doing. So Rick had worked all night. He was working shift work. And so I was driving. We were going from Winnipeg to Thunder Bay and eventually to White River to meet my cousins, which will be another story that I think that we'll have Rick on for, to explain his first meeting of the cousins. Anyway, as we were driving, we were just past Deacon's Corners when I noticed what looked like an elderly indigenous woman, and it turns out that's exactly what it was. So I passed her and she was thumbing for a ride, and I thought, whoa, wait a minute. If I don't pick this woman up, who is? I know I'm a safe person for her. So I pulled over to the side of the road and she hopped in and kind of, did a little chit chat. Hey, how you doing? Where are you going? I'm going pretty far. How far do you want to go? And she just needed a ride to Kenora, which is only 2 hours away in my 8-hour drive, right? So Rick kind of was stirring in the back seat a little bit, wondering what in the world. I was inviting some stranger into his vehicle. And what was the most amazing thing, we just talked about how, when we meet a stranger, and is that a loss of time or is it a gain of so much? And I have to say, in this case, it was a huge gain. So she was headed to her grandson's first birthday. So it was really exciting time in their family to celebrate this baby. And I asked her, I said, oh, do you work? And she said, oh, yeah, I work at I think it was a bread factory or something. Like, I'm just not showing up for work today. And so I was like, core value, let people know when you're not going to be there. I said, you need to stop and call. She's like, don't worry about it. It'll be fine. And so I kind of had that tucked in the back of my mind that, wait a minute, we probably should have called your work. So now I've really inserted myself into her life within the first 30 seconds. And so again, my curiosity gets the better of me, and I move into question mode, and I want to know everything about this woman. And she, thank goodness, wanted to share, and I felt so privileged and deeply honored with what she shared with me. She talked to me about how she was the youngest of 6 children, and her mom died when she was really little, and her dad didn't really know what to do. She and her siblings, all of them ended up in residential school. And being young, she was only 4, she wasn't allowed to be in school. She told me how, all the things that we've read and we've heard about, she explained all of them to me. How her hair was cut, how they would scrub her arms trying to rub, and these are her words, not mine, rub the Indian out of her. And so her arms were all, had been scrubbed as this little 4-year-old kid abrasively. Because she wasn't old enough to be in school, they locked her in a locker for the day. So obviously I was silent, and I just let her tell her story. And I do think about this woman. And it's weird. I know it sounds cheesy, and some of you are like, whatever, Kerry. But every time I drive down that part of the highway, it's almost like I can see her walking towards Kenora. And I'm like, wow, what I would have missed had I not picked her up, right? What part of that? And I don't know. I don't know if I could call her a cousin because she was an elder, but maybe like an elder cousin. And so, yeah.
Kokum.
A Kokum. Yeah. I don't remember her name, but I do remember, that's cheesy. I do remember how I felt. And I do remember how I felt. I felt honored and ashamed at the same time.
Where do you think that shame comes from?
White. Because as much as we're Métis, we're the white Métis. And so I feel responsible.
Well,
do you know what I mean?
I do. I totally understand that feeling. I'm just wondering if, like, I asked you because I have similar feelings, and we'll probably talk about this in another episode.
Yes.
But I mean, we're kind of like 3 different steps on the same ladder right now. Like you have your Métis.
I don't.
Card. Laura is applying.
No, Rick
you
does.
don't. I thought you had applied for it.
Laura, you're applying?
I'm applying.
I had all the paperwork. Laura's applying. I had all the paperwork, but I feel really conflicted about it. I know that the idea is that anybody can self-proclaim, but then I also have this kind of, this great vast void of connection.
Mm-hmm.
Like there is no connection because we had, a generation of family that completely denied, and I wish we could ask them why.
I think it goes back to shame, that it was shameful. We still have a generation of disconnection that don't want to acknowledge.
I wonder sometimes if it was self-preservation though as well.
Yeah.
I mean, I attended a Métis meeting, and there was a lady that was talking, and I wish I could remember her name, but they talked about, it was just like a later conversation. It wasn't part of the meeting, but they were explaining, and actually I think this might not have been at that meeting. It might have been at a Red River dancing performance where they were explaining about how the Red River dance came about, and the fact that, Métis people were not allowed to dance. So they wouldn't, at night in their homes, they'd do the Red River dance, and it looked like people just walking past the windows, when in fact, below the window, their feet were going 90 miles an hour. And I wonder if that shame was something, or that fear was something that our elder generations were like, it's just a thing about us that everybody knows, but nobody talks about. My mother has always said that when she thinks of like the more visibly Métis people like her grandmother, she says, you know, the things that she did and the way that she looked, to her, it just, you know, that was just
Yeah.
grandma.
Mhm.
You know, it wasn't like she didn't separate her from her Métis-ness, or it was not a thing.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I mean? I don't know if I explained what my thought process on that all was, but just I feel like that loss of connection from, you know, there's no proudness in declaring that I'm Métis when I don't know what it means. I
It's a
can't,
journey, though. It's a
other than,
journey.
you
Yeah.
know, knowing. Yeah, it is a journey.
Yeah.
I think everyone feels different, and you have to make that decision for yourself,
Yeah.
obviously.
It's fascinating too because I have all of our genealogy. Well, not all of it, but I have a fair amount of it right now that I'm digitizing. And the amount of things that I'm learning that I had absolutely no idea about or any connection to is just, it's overwhelming in a very positive way, but also you end up with that shame and that, you know, all these feelings come up, right?
Is it a feeling of
Yeah, it's almost
loss,
like a grief.
like
Yeah.
of
Mm-hmm.
loss? Because yeah, it is totally. That's a good way of explaining it. Yeah, I identify
But
with
then
that.
also and once I pass this along to you guys, once it's digitized, I'm sure you'll
Mm-hmm.
feel the feelings, right? But there's also a sense of pride in who we are once you discover this. But there's definitely a huge disconnect. You know, it's very hush hush, especially in our
Mm-hmm.
neck of the woods. So it's kind of hard to process it because it's something you want to talk about, but either nobody knows what you're talking about, or you get the gatekeeping answer, which I'm sure we'll
Yeah.
dive more into that
Yeah.
the gatekeeping at some point. Yeah, no, it's a journey in itself, and eventually I probably will write something about it. But
Yeah. Understanding that part of our history and our culture, though, I believe is like that huge step towards healing some of those gaps that we feel and that grief that we feel. We have the opportunity in our generation and the next to be able to restore some of that, forgive the term, righteous pride that was lost for a long time. And I know I had, and unfortunately I'll have to redo it because the thread was so old it just withered. But it was my grandmother's, and it was a beaded necklace that my mom had gotten from her, and it's in her favorite color, which was turquoise. To think that she had that and it wasn't something that was out in the open, hashtag gatekeeping. It was something that she had. So when she passed, that was my mom had found and, you know, passed that to me. You know, some of these stories and their experiences, even with their mother, like speaking of our grandmothers, unfortunately are lost.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that is also part of the grief, is when we don't share the stories, when we don't have those that ability to connect or to pass along those stories. A couple of years ago, we were at, as some of you know, I belong to, or I used to participate with a women's hand drumming group, and I'm sure that that will come around again. But we were at, I don't like to call it a performance. It was an opportunity to share the songs. And there was a lady there, an elder from the community. Her name's Ruth, and she was sharing stories from her childhood, and it was so cool. And so Wyatt, who would have been maybe 10 at the time, went up, and I went with him. And she turned to him and said, "You need to continue these stories. Your stories are important, and the stories from your family." And was kind of like, kind of half giving him the gears and encouraging him, right? That is an important
Zeroed
thing,
in
is
on
to
him.
continue these stories on and to pass them on for generations, because that is part of our culture, is Métis culture, would be storytelling. And I think that's why the three of us navigate towards that and use it in our teaching, as a way of connecting ourselves, maybe subconsciously, to that part of our heritage. And so stories are important.
Just to launch off of that as well, I've written about this before, but I don't really feel that connection to telling the stories necessarily on our side. However, my grandfather on my dad's side was the one I think who had a heavily huge influence on me documenting, whether it be vlogging, blogging, writing, like all of these things, picture taking. Most of my memories of my grandfather are of him with this ridiculously
Yes.
large VHS
Yes,
recorder
I remember
on his
this.
shoulder.
Yes.
So I find I get a lot of that from him. However, that being said, he was always the one that was recording these stories for us and doing all this stuff, which was awesome, but very rarely would share stories about him and his past. It's just fascinating that it's almost genetic. It probably is that carries through, right? This fascination of needing to tell our stories, and hopefully this inspires some people to start talking with their families and their elders and their children about the importance of these stories and passing them along. And I think in a way that's almost why we're doing this, so that our story does continue and it doesn't just end up at some dead
Well,
end.
I know, like on my paternal side, especially with my uncles, my kids love sitting around and listening to these guys tell stories. They're great storytellers. They have a lot of stories. They're old and they have stories, no offense, uncles. But they do. They have fascinating stories, and the way they tell them, you're right there with them. And so their stories,
Yes.
actually, my one uncle has written a book called, The First 75 Years. And a lot of it is not just his genealogy, but his journals and his stories, and how lucky we are that there was someone that was courageous enough to do that and had, the dedication towards that. Otherwise, he's 92, 93 this year, and some of that would be lost for sure.
Just to bring it back to that initial story that you shared with us about picking up the elder who was hitchhiking. So maybe perhaps our role right now is to collect our own stories and to listen to the stories of other people. And I think that kind of listening to your story about this lady and her experience with residential schools and I had an experience as well where I was participating in a focus group, and these two gentlemen were descendants of people who were in the residential schools. Actually, I think one of them also attended a residential school, and they were giving just kind of background on their experience. And I felt really strongly that was kind of a way for me to kind of bridge that gap of information and of just history in my own family is to listen to the stories of people that maybe had a life experience that was parallel our ancestors, experience. That's my job, is actually to listen.
Well, as you're saying, no, I'm so wanting to interject here, because if there's nothing else I have learned in exploring our indigenous side and what that culture means, it's to listen. I have so many questions for them, right? Every time we meet, I'm like, I have so many questions. But within the first few times I met with these women, and gathering in a circle of women is so powerful to begin with. But as we met, I had all these questions, and one lady said, it will come to you, or in time. And she kept being like, essentially telling me to shut it, right? But in a polite way, like, you will learn this. This is something you will gain and you will learn. And it's the importance of being quiet. I talk about this in my big girl job. We have 2 eyes, 2 ears, and a heart, and 1 mouth. So there's a ratio there that should be considered, right? And so I absolutely agree with you, is the importance of listening. That lady's story, that's as much as that's my story of picking her up,
I think
that's not my story. That's her story, right?
it's her story, but I think that it also helps, like personally, when I hear other stories, and especially, indigenous people and Métis people sharing stories, it kind of
Yes.
helps me to bridge that gap of grief.
Yes.
It kind of gives me a place, a puzzle piece to, why am I feeling this grief? And because I don't have like the understanding to know why I feel this way. And like I can't resolve it myself. And the only way I kind of feel a sense of resolution is by kind of being witness to the stories of others.
Mm-hmm.
I
Is
love that, the
what I
way that you
really
worded
wanted to
that, a
say.
witness to the stories of others. I think that's part of why we're doing
Yes.
this, right? Of welcoming our cousins in so that we can be a witness to their stories and to validate. And for a lot of us, that grief that maybe we do feel that disconnection. Some folks might not have a great connection to their cousin, right? Or to their family or anything like that, or may feel completely alone. And so hopefully we're able to build this safe community where people can be a witness to their own story, a witness to other stories, and just to feel validated and to help bridge that gap of grief that many people do feel and might not even recognize what they're feeling. Yeah. Cool.
Exactly. Yeah.
Um,
I definitely am not here to be like a know-it-all to tell people how they should feel or how they should act. I really
Yeah.
want this to be like a conversation on, a multitude of things, not just like our chosen families, our blood families, like, but on all sorts of things that we kind of experience
Tyne,
as
did you have
human
something to
beings.
add?
An open discussion.
well, just to add to that, bearing witness to other people's stories and to thank them and have that gratitude for them to have the courage to share those stories, to give people that ear in that time of day to just let their story fall free without necessarily having anything to say back to them than just to say thank you for sharing. Because sometimes people are just looking for that outlet, like the Kokum that you spoke of. Maybe she just needed, to tell her story to someone without them saying, well, here's my, sympathy, or here's this, or, there's sometimes that people just need to speak and to know that they've been heard. And that's it. It's that listen lady aspect of thank you for sharing and thank you for having that courage to tell me, or however you want to word it.
Mm-hmm. Do you need a listening cousin? Feel free to leave us a message. Let us know if it's okay if we air it or if you would rather keep it private. Visit hellocousin.org.